Good day, everyone. My name is Dr. Dexnadom from the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, Ghana. I'm so happy, very much elated to be a part of this maiden international conference on research in educational sciences organized by the College of Education, Mindanao State University in Philippines. The theme chosen for this conference is more fitting because in this post-pandemic era, we are all thinking of proactive ways of redesigning the global education system to make room for alternative delivery platforms. The theme for my presentation is multimodal delivery approaches in the post-pandemic era, the universal design for learning framework. In the fall of 2019 and in the early phase of 2020, the world, as we are aware, was struck with one of the most catastrophic pandemics in our history, COVID-19. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted the activities that we engaged in our daily lives. And one of the areas where the COVID-19 pandemic impact was much felt is the global education system. It shook it to its very foundation. Sadly, the traditional delivery mode, which is the face-to-face way of delivering teaching and learning activities, was disrupted because of the sudden shutdown of schools. As a result of this, there was the need for educational institutions globally to devise alternative modes of delivering the right of education to students in all academic levels. One of the early intervention strategies was the emergency remote teaching, often referred to as the ERTs. Of course, the ERTs have chalked many successes, but there are some cardinal limitations with the ERTs. One has to do with the use of digital technologies in deploying teaching and learning activities virtually. Sadly, educational institutions globally have learned very painful lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic's impact, negative impacts on education. Now, as we move into the post-pandemic phase of our lives, it is crucial that educational institutions and educators globally devise means of delivering education using multimodal delivery strategies or approaches. This is quite crucial looking at the diversities in the makeup of our students, many of whom have been disturbed emotionally as a result of the COVID-19 impact. I believe in the words of Thomas Armstrong that what we need now in this post-pandemic era is a strength-based classroom. A strength-based classroom, as Armstrong defined it, is a classroom where all students feel represented, all students are seen as equals, all students are respected, irrespective of the variance or the differences in their emotional, intellectual, or physical makeup. As we think about this strength-based classroom, the instructional strategy that comes to mind is the universal design for learning. The universal design for learning stands out as a framework that is all-inclusive and democratic, respecting the differences in the makeup of our students, offering multiple choices in terms of the representation of content, engagement, as well as assessment. So in my presentation, I'll be explaining the concept of UDL, the purposes and relevance of UDL in relation to the three brain networks. Then I'll be discussing how UDL could be actualized in the classroom, offering multiple delivery approaches in terms of presentation of content, engagement, and assessment strategies in the classroom. Let me begin with the concept of UDL. UDL in education is a borrowed concept from the field of architecture. There is this concept in architecture called universal design. And what universal design concept in architecture stands for is designing buildings and products as well as landscapes and environment to make room for access for all kinds of people, including persons living with disability. When this concept was borrowed as UDL in the field of education, the focus has been shifted from just planning educational strategies to cater for the limitations of persons living with disability to variability, where all students feel respected and represented in the classroom. UDL sets in two major fields or disciplines: neurosciences and learning sciences. And the two principal drivers of the UDL framework is flexibility and multiplicity in the delivery of the curriculum, from the planning of lessons, the enactment of the lesson in the classroom, assessment, and all facets of the teaching curriculum. Universal design for learning as an instructional strategy has been empirically proven to be valid. That is why we're saying it's a valid framework or a valid scientific framework, and is rooted in the philosophy that when content is presented in high flexibility and also multiplicity, it will make room for embracing the diversities in the makeup of our students. UDL sets on three main theoretical propositions. One is that we shouldn't kowtow to one-size-fits-all curriculum. We have to be able to provide alternatives for the variance of our students in the classroom. UDL is also a concept that is woven as part of the lesson from its planning stages, enactment, and to the last stage, which is the evaluation. And UDL offers access to all students. One important factor in the delivery of a UDL compliant lesson is removing all potential barriers to learning on the pathways of our students. When we are talking of barriers, three main barriers comes to mind: academic barriers, physical barriers, social or emotional barriers. In terms of the academic barriers, language, lack of background knowledge to what we are teaching in the classroom, as well as reading or decoding skills of students could pose academic barriers. Under the physical barriers, we have limitations in the physical makeup of our students. Some have low vision or are visually impaired. We have those who have hearing challenges, hearing impairment, and those who have movement needs. Under social or emotional barriers, we also have students who exhibit disruptive behavior, students who have low confidence, and students who would want to work in solitude without working in groups. All these barriers in deploying UDL centered compliant lesson, there is the need for educators to find strategies in minimizing or ridding off all these barriers. Another equally important factor that instructors must give attention to is the way that their students learn. Students have different ways of learning, which we often refer to as learning styles. Some learn through the things that they watch, they look at, diagrams, images. Others also learn from listening. We call them auditory learners. We have others who learn amidst their colleagues, the social learners. Others would want to learn independently. the solitary learners. We have verbal learners, we have those who learn through writing. An instructor who is implementing UDL must ensure that all these learning styles are factored in the materials that are used for the lesson delivery. This is important so that we will have a representation of all students in the lesson delivery. UDL targets the development of the three brain networks. The first part being the recognition brain network, which is concerned with the what's of learning, and this deals with how learners identify and describes information that they learn. The second brain network, which is the strategic brain network, deals with the how of learning, and that also takes charge of how learners analyze and synthesize information that they learn in a lesson. And the last brain network, which is the affective brain network, which answers the why of learning, is also concerned with how learners engage with the information or the content that they've learned in a class. And interestingly, these three brain networks are connected with the three principles that undergird the UDL framework. The first one is multiple means of representation, the second being multiple means of engagement, and the third being multiple means of action and expression. So as I earlier hinted, UDL is about multiplicity in the representation of content, in the engagement of learners, and also in the evaluation or assessment of learners. As instructors, the expected learning outcomes that we show to our students before we commence a lesson are like stairs. We have to help the students to be able to achieve them, to be able to climb each of the steps on the stairs. We are not just to present it for students to listen to them. This makes us remember the quote of Václav Havel, the former president of the Czech Republic, who said that it is not just enough to stair up the steps, but we must step up the stairs. And that is what all instructors must endeavor to do to help all our students, irrespective of the differences in their makeup, to be able to achieve the expected learning outcomes. And that is what UDL stands for. UDL does three important things to help students achieve learning outcomes. The first one is that UDL ensures the provision of access to the learning content by eliminating all potential barriers to learning. Secondly, UDL heightens participation in learning by providing several options. Remember, we said UDL sits on the belief of diversity or multiplicity. So in the presentation of content, we give several options for students to be able to learn and participate effectively in the lesson. And lastly, UDL helps in tracking the progress of students using rubrics and other forms of support. All these things are to help students, irrespective of how their learning patterns are like, to be able to maximize their learning outcomes in every lesson. Every UDL lesson begins with a clear and standardized learning goal. And this learning goal is framed or written in such a way that it accommodates the differences in the learning styles, as I've already hinted. So let's cite an example. Suppose you want to teach students a skill in understanding the concept of time. Instead of restricting students to just narrate how the concept of time is expressed, it's important that you give room for the other learning styles where you ask students to even draw their understanding of the concept of time, narrate their understanding of the concept of time, produce something that depicts the understanding of the concept of time. If we give room for this multiplicity, then we are indeed implementing the UDL framework in our lesson delivery. In the presentation of content to students, it is important that the instructor uses multiple means of representation. What this calls for is that the learning content to be presented to students must come in different forms. It's not just text provision of handouts, but also videos of the content must be provided. Audio recordings of the content must be provided. Podcasts could be produced, and then these ones will be given to students who learn best through listening. The instructor could also equally use real-life objects in the classroom, or even make the students act out a story of the content that they are learning. When an instructor ensures that content are represented in multiple forms like this, it helps in reaching out to different factions of the students in the class. More so, an instructor must tactfully incorporate the use of ICT tools whilst he presents content to the learners. Again, instructors must endeavor to tactfully use social media platforms like WhatsApp, Facebook, Telegram to share content of a particular lesson. When an instructor does this, another important principle of UDL is ensuring multiple means of engagement. It is important that instructors actively engage their students in the teaching and learning activities that they carry out in the classroom. How can an instructor do this in a UDL format? First, an instructor must highlight the relevance of the content that he is teaching the students. If students come to appreciate the relevance of what they are learning, they will be more engaged with the content. Secondly, the instructor must be flexible enough in creating an enabling learning environment, giving room for students on how best they want to learn, rather than restricting them to a particular way of learning. Another way that an instructor can ensure active engagement of the content in a UDL format is always offering positive reinforcement. When students do well in a class by giving favorable comments in line with what we are expecting, we have to demonstrate our motivation by the words of encouragement, or we could even express it using gestures or visuals. And when we do that, the students will be more prepared to learn the content. Another way of engaging students is offering a way that they can track their progress using checklists and also rubrics where they can be able to know how they are performing in the lesson. When we do this, we would ensure high motivation of our students, and they will be prepared to be more engaged with the content that we are teaching them in the classroom. The third principle of UDL calls for the use of multiple means of action and expression. This is about how we ascertain the understanding of our students with the lesson that we have enacted in the classroom. How do we evaluate their understanding levels. And that is what multiple means of action and expression calls for. The first thing that we have to do in a UDL compliant way of giving assignment is to offer students support that will help them to undertake the assignment that we've given them. So we will provide work exemplars that details how we want them to do the assignment. Also, we give them well detailed rubrics and checklists that helps them to track if they are on the right path in carrying out the assignment. More importantly, we allow flexibility in the submission of assignment. When we give deadlines, we would want to be flexible enough and then extend it for students who are falling behind or students who are struggling. More so, we would want to give room for multiple ways that students will demonstrate their understanding of the learned content. Instead of restricting them to submit written assignment, we would want to open up the options for our students. Allow students to do audio recordings of their understanding, allow students to present assignments in video formats, allow students to compose songs that expresses their understanding of the content that they've learned, allow students to use storyboards in demonstrating the understanding of what they've learned. If we give them these multiple means, we will have students who have different learning styles to be able to engage with their curriculum and especially the content that we are teaching them in the class. So in our attempt to redesign the global education system using alternative delivery platforms at this conference, it is important that we also look at the Universal Design for Learning framework and how best it could be used in offering multiplicity in the classroom, not just in the presentation of content, but also in the engagement of students and also in ascertaining their action and expression. But to apply the principles of UDL effectively in a class, instructors must be highly innovative and creative, and then look at local solutions to some of the daunting challenges that they face in the delivery of teaching and learning in their classrooms. It is also equally important that the instructors accommodate the differences in the makeup of their students, especially in their learning styles, by offering multiplicity as they deliver content. I thank the Mindanao State University College of Education very much for inviting me to give this plenary speech, and I wish everyone a success at this conference. Thank you very much.